All right, so are you ready to dive into the subtle art of not giving a feck with me today?
Absolutely. It's a book that really makes you think.
Yeah, I mean, the title itself is kind of in your face, right?
It definitely grabs your attention,
Okay.
which is probably the point.
It's not your typical self-help stuff, that's for sure.
No, it's not. It's more like a refreshing slap in the face.
So let's talk about Mark Manson, the author. What's his deal?
Well, he's not afraid to challenge conventional wisdom, that's for sure.
Yeah, and he uses some pretty interesting examples, like Charles Bukowski,
Ah, yes, Bukowski, the ultimate don't try guy.
which is kind of ironic considering he became a successful writer.
Right, but his tombstone literally says, don't try.
It's like he's saying, screw expectations, just do your thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that kind of sets the tone for Manson's whole philosophy.
So, not giving a feck, it's not about being lazy or apathetic.
Right at all. It's about being intentional with your energy.
Okay, so like choosing what really matters to you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Manson argues that we're constantly bombarded with messages telling us to care about everything.
Buy this, achieve that, look a certain way. It's
Yeah.
exhausting.
It is. And it creates what he calls the feedback loop from hell.
The feedback loop from hell. That sounds intense. What's that all about?
It's this constant striving for more, never feeling satisfied, always chasing the next
Oh,
goal.
yeah, I know that feeling. Like you're on a treadmill going nowhere.
Precisely. Like that story Manson tells about the elderly lady with the coupons.
What was that story again?
She's meticulously clipping coupons at the grocery store. Really focused.
Okay, Han.
But then one coupon doesn't work and she completely loses it.
Oh, wow. It's like her whole world falls apart.
It's as if those coupons were her only source of meaning in life.
That's kind of sad, actually. But it makes you think, what are we all giving too many fecks about in our own lives?
That's the question, isn't it? What are those little things that are taking up way too much space in our heads?
It's like those anxieties that keep us up at night, you know?
Yeah, or those comparisons we make to other people.
Always feeling like we're not good enough.
Exactly. And that leads us to Manson's next big point, the paradox of happiness.
The paradox of happiness. How can happiness be a paradox?
Well, Manson argues that happiness isn't about avoiding problems or striving for constant positivity.
Wait, so you're saying problems are good for us?
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
He introduces this character called Disappointment Panda to illustrate this.
Disappointment Panda. Okay, that's a new one. What's his deal?
He's this brutally honest voice of reason, kind of like the friend who tells it like it is.
I think we all need a disappointment panda in our lives.
He reminds us that struggle is actually necessary for growth.
It's like that saying, no pain, no gain.
Exactly. He even uses the analogy of stubbing your toe.
Stubbing your toe. How does that relate to happiness?
It's not pleasant, but it's a signal that something is wrong. A chance to learn and adjust.
Okay, I see. So like pain is a feedback mechanism.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It tells us to pay attention to something that needs to change.
So we shouldn't try to avoid problems altogether.
No. Avoiding problems just leads to more problems.
The key is to face them head on and learn from them.
And Disappointment Panda is there to remind us of that.
But sometimes it's hard to face those challenges, isn't it?
It can be. And Manson outlines two common pitfalls that keep us from doing this.
Which are?
The victim mentality and the always right mindset.
Okay, so the victim mentality is like blaming others for our problems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Refusing to take responsibility for our own lives.
And the always right mindset is like never admitting we're wrong.
Right. It prevents us from learning from our mistakes.
So in a way, they're both about avoiding responsibility.
Exactly. And this ties directly into Manson's discussion of self-worth versus entitlement.
Self-worth versus entitlement. That sounds interesting. What's the difference?
Well, Manson uses contrasting stories to illustrate this. He talks about Jimmy, the delusional startup founder.
Okay, and Jimmy's problem is?
He's all about inflating his ego, spending more time talking than actually doing.
So he feels entitled to success without putting in the work.
Exactly.
Yep.
And then there's your own experience of feeling entitled in relationships.
Yeah, that goes back to some pretty intense stuff from my childhood.
It's like those early experiences shaped your expectations in relationships.
And not always in a healthy way.
Yeah.
I can see that now.
Both of these stories, despite their different contexts, highlight the dangers of entitlement.
So it's like a false sense of self-worth.
Exactly. It's based on external validation or a sense of deserving without actually earning it.
And Manson argues that true self-worth comes from something else entirely.
Right. It comes from confronting the negative aspects of ourselves.
So like acknowledging our flaws and taking responsibility for our actions.
Exactly. It's about facing the uncomfortable truths about ourselves and then choosing to move forward.
So growth comes from facing our demons, not running from them.
And you know what's interesting? Manson connects this sense of entitlement to the media landscape.
Oh, yeah, I can see that. How so?
It's like we're constantly bombarded with images of exceptionalism, making us feel inadequate if we're not living some extraordinary life.
It's that whole keeping up with the Joneses mentality.
Exactly. This constant comparison to unrealistic standards can definitely fuel feelings of entitlement.
So it's not just about our individual experiences, but also about the cultural messages we're absorbing every day.
And this leads us to Manson's powerful idea of choosing your problems. He uses the story of William James to illustrate this.
William James. Refresh my memory. Who was he again?
He was this sickly Harvard dropout who went on to become a renowned philosopher.
And his story illustrates the idea of choosing your problems.
Exactly. Despite all these physical and mental setbacks, James found meaning by focusing on what he could control.
Like his actions, his thoughts, his responses to the world around him.
Precisely. He chose to create his own meaning, despite his circumstances.
That's pretty inspiring. So what's the takeaway here?
That we might not be able to control the cards we're dealt, but we can control how we play them.
We're responsible for how we respond, how we choose to move forward, even in the face of challenges.
And I think that's where your experience with your ex-girlfriend comes in.
Oh, yeah, that was a tough one. But ultimately, it was in taking responsibility for my own happiness that I was able to move on.
That's a great example of how choosing to focus on what you can control can lead to real growth.
It's about using those experiences as fuel to make better choices in the future.
Exactly. And I think that's a great place to pause for now.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much more to explore in Manson's book.
So we were talking about choosing our problems right.
Yeah.
But how do we even know we're choosing the right ones?
Yeah.
Like the problems that actually matter?
Yeah, that's a good question. How do we figure out what to focus on?
Well, that's where values come in.
Okay, values, like morals and stuff.
Kind of. It's more about what you prioritize in life,
Right.
what you see as important.
So how do we figure out what our values are?
That's the tricky part. Manson says we often inherit values without even realizing it.
You inherit them, like from our parents.
Yeah, or from our culture society, the media, all sorts of influences.
So we might be living by someone else's values without even knowing it.
Yeah, it's possible. And that can lead to a lot of inner conflict.
Like we're trying to live a life that doesn't actually align with what we truly believe in.
Exactly. And Manson uses that example of the brother who disapproves of his sister's engagement.
I remember that one. What was his deal again?
He was so convinced that he knew what was best for his sister, that she was making a huge mistake.
But it was more about his own values, right? Like his need to be right.
Exactly. He was clinging to those values without questioning whether they were actually serving anyone.
And it ended up causing a lot of unnecessary drama.
Right. So the question is, how do we figure out which values are actually our values?
Yeah, how do we know what truly matters to us?
Well, Manson gives us some really helpful questions to ask ourselves.
Okay, like what?
The first one is, why do I hold this value? It forces us to dig deep and examine our beliefs.
So, like, where did this belief come from? Is it really mine, or did I just adopt it from someone else?
Exactly. And the second question is even more challenging. What would it mean if I were wrong?
Oof, that's a tough one. It makes you confront the possibility that you might be wrong.
And that can be scary, but it's also incredibly liberating.
Because it opens you up to new possibilities.
Exactly. It allows you to let go of beliefs that might be holding you back.
I like that. And what's the third question?
Would being wrong create a better or worse problem?
So it's about weighing the consequences of our beliefs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Are they actually leading us towards a better life? Or are they creating more problems?
Those are some really powerful questions. They make you think about your values in a whole new way.
And Manson doesn't stop there. He also emphasizes the importance of doubting ourselves.
Doubting ourselves, isn't that a bad thing?
Not necessarily. It's about being open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
So it's not about putting ourselves down. It's about being open to new information.
Exactly. It's about having a healthy dose of skepticism, both towards ourselves and the world around us.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not about blindly accepting everything we're told.
Right. It's about critically evaluating information and forming our own opinions.
And you know what's interesting? Manson doesn't shy away from the big existential questions either.
Like death.
Exactly. He tackles it head on.
It's kind of unavoidable, isn't it? Once you start questioning your values and what truly matters.
Yeah, you have to confront the fact that we're all going to die someday.
And that can be scary, but it can also be incredibly motivating.
How so?
Well, it makes you realize that life is precious and that we shouldn't waste time on things that don't matter.
It's like that saying, live each day as if it were your last.
Exactly. Manson even shares the story of his friend Josh's death and how that experience changed him,
It's a powerful reminder that life is fragile and unpredictable.
and that we should make the most of the time we have.
So how does this all tie back to the idea of not giving a feck?
Well, it's about accepting the things we can't control,
Hmm.
like death, for example.
Okay. But how do you just accept something like that?
It's not easy. But Manson argues that it's in accepting the reality of death that we find true freedom.
Freedom from what?
Freedom from the fear of death. Freedom from the need to create a legacy. Freedom to live in the present moment.
That's a pretty profound idea. It's like once you accept that you're going to die someday, you can finally start living.
Exactly. And Manson even shares this incredible story about his experience at the Cape of Good Hope.
What happened there?
He was standing on this cliff, feeling the vastness of the ocean.
Mm.
And it was this confrontation with his own mortality.
Sounds intense.
It was. But it also led to a deeper appreciation for life. He realized that every moment is a gift.
That's beautiful. I love that. So it's not about being reckless or careless. It's about living life to the fullest.
Exactly. It's about embracing the good and the bad, the joy and the sorrow, all of it.
And speaking of the bad, Manson also talks a lot about the importance of failure.
Failure. I thought we were talking about happiness.
I know, right? But Manson argues that failure is actually essential for growth.
How so?
Well, he uses his own experiences to illustrate this. He talks about how he graduated into a terrible job market.
So like he struggled to find work.
Yeah, he even had to move back in with his parents.
That's got to be tough.
It was. But he says those early experiences of failure actually gave him the freedom to take risks because he realized that he had nothing to lose.
Exactly. And that he could always bounce back.
So it's like hitting rock bottom and realizing that you're stronger than you thought.
Yeah. And that failure is not the end of the world. It's just a stepping stone.
Okay, I'm starting to see how failure can be a good thing. But what about the fear of failure?
That's a big one. But Manson says we often get stuck waiting for motivation to strike before taking action.
Like waiting for the perfect moment.
Exactly. But he argues that it's actually the other way around. Action creates motivation.
So just start doing something, anything to get the ball rolling.
Precisely. And he also talks about the importance of commitment.
Commitment.
In a world of endless options, it's easy to get distracted and spread ourselves too thin.
I know, I'm definitely guilty of that.
But Manson argues that it's the depth of our experiences, not the breadth, that brings us the most fulfillment.
So it's about focusing on a few key areas and really going deep.
Exactly. He talks about how he made a conscious decision to narrow his focus to his writing, his relationship, and his closest friendships.
And that made him happier.
He says it created a sense of freedom and opportunity. It's like by saying no to everything else, he created space for what truly mattered to flourish.
That's counterintuitive, isn't it? We're always told to chase experiences to keep our options open.
But sometimes it's in choosing to commit that we find the greatest rewards.
Makes sense. And this idea of commitment ties directly into Manson's discussion of relationships.
Ah, yes. Relationships, the ultimate test of our values and boundaries.
What does Manson have to say about this?
He believes that healthy relationships are built on a few key principles:
Like what?
clear boundaries, a strong sense of responsibility, and the willingness to both reject and be rejected.
Reject and be rejected. That sounds kind of harsh.
It's not about being mean. It's about setting healthy boundaries and respecting each other's individuality.
So like being able to say no when you need to?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And being okay with it if someone says no to you.
That's not always easy, though.
No, it's not. But it's essential for a healthy relationship.
Because otherwise you end up in that dynamic of victim and savior.
Exactly. And that never ends well.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
So how do we create those healthy boundaries in relationships?
It starts with self-awareness, knowing what you're willing to tolerate and what you're not.
And being able to communicate those boundaries clearly.
Exactly. And being willing to walk away if those boundaries are not respected.
So it's about putting your own needs first.
In a way, yes. It's about recognizing that you're responsible for your own happiness.
And that you can't rely on someone else to make you happy.
Exactly. And that sometimes walking away from a relationship, even if it's painful, is the healthiest thing you can do.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all of these concepts are interconnected. The values, the boundaries, the responsibility.
It all comes back to taking ownership of our own lives.
And choosing to focus on what truly matters.
Exactly. But there's one more piece of the puzzle that we haven't talked about yet.
What's that?
Uncertainty.
Uncertainty. I thought we were trying to find certainty and stability.
That's what we're conditioned to believe. But Manson argues that our need for certainty can actually hold us back
Hold us back from what?
from growth, from new experiences, from truly living.
It's like clinging to that familiar shoreline, even if it means staying in shallow waters.
Exactly. He believes that it's in embracing uncertainty that we open ourselves up to new possibilities.
But uncertainty can be scary.
It can be, but it's also where the magic happens.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How do we embrace uncertainty?
By being willing to be wrong, by questioning our beliefs, by stepping outside of our comfort zones.
So it's about being open to new experiences, even if they're a little bit scary.
Exactly. And Manson uses this fascinating study to illustrate this. It's about people in a room with buttons to push.
Buttons, what kind of study is this?
They're trying to figure out a pattern to make a light flash.
Hmm.
But the catch is that the light flashes randomly.
So there is no pattern.
Nope. But people will still create these elaborate theories, convinced they've found the answer.
Even though it's all random. That's kind of funny.
It is. But it also highlights how our brains are wired to seek out patterns and create meaning.
Even when it's not there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this tendency can be both helpful and harmful.
How so?
Well, it allows us to learn and make sense of the world. But it can also lead us to cling to false beliefs.
So like those people in the study who were convinced they'd found a pattern even though there wasn't one.
Exactly. And it can make us resistant to new information.
Because it challenges our existing beliefs.
Precisely. So how do we navigate that tension between finding meaning and remaining open to new possibilities?
That's a good question. I'm not sure.
Well, Manson encourages us to question our beliefs, to actively seek out evidence that might contradict our assumptions.
So like don't just take things at face value.
Exactly. Dig deeper, challenge your own thinking, and be willing to change your mind.
That's easier said than done.
It is,
Yeah.
but it's essential for growth.
Okay. So we've talked about values, death, failure, uncertainty. What else?
The media.
Ah, yes. The media, it's everywhere.
And Manson has some strong opinions about it. He believes it can be a major source of unhappiness.
How so?
Well, for one thing, he thinks it contributes to our sense of entitlement.
Like how?
Think about all those images of exceptionalism we're bombarded with every day.
Oh, yeah, like those perfect Instagram lives.
Exactly. Makes us feel like we're not enough. Like we need to be doing more, achieving more.
It's that whole comparison is the thief of joy thing.
Exactly. And Manson calls this the tyranny of exceptionalism.
Tyranny of exceptionalism, what's that mean?
It's this idea that we're constantly being told that we need to be extraordinary to be happy.
But that's not realistic for most people.
Nope. And it sets us up for disappointment.
Because we're constantly comparing ourselves to these unrealistic standards.
Exactly. And it could lead to all sorts of unhealthy coping mechanisms.
Like what?
Chasing get-rich-quick schemes. Seeking validation through social media, numbing ourselves with distractions.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. And Manson also criticizes the media's tendency to exploit outrage.
Outrage.
Yeah, like focusing on sensationalized stories that generate clicks and views.
Oh, yeah, clickbait headline.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's all about getting our attention, even if it means stirring up negativity.
And what's wrong with that?
Well, for one thing, it creates a culture of fear and anxiety.
Because we're constantly being bombarded with negative news.
Exactly. And it also distracts us from real issues,
Like what?
like poverty, inequality, climate change, the big stuff. So it's not that we shouldn't care about these things. It's that we should be discerning about where we get our information.
And how we react to it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
We need to be aware of how the media can manipulate our emotions.
And choose to focus on solutions rather than getting caught up in the outrage cycle.
Exactly. And Manson uses a fascinating story to illustrate this point. It's about a Japanese soldier named Hiroo Onoda.
Hiroo Onoda, who's that?
He was a soldier who continued fighting World War II for almost 30 years after it had ended.
30 years? How is that even possible?
He was hiding in the jungle, refusing to believe the war was over.
Wow. That's dedication.
It's more than that. He had created this reality for himself, this narrative of being a loyal soldier.
And he was willing to sacrifice everything to maintain that belief.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it highlights the dangers of clinging to outdated beliefs, even when presented with overwhelming evidence to the contrary.
So it's like he was living in his own little world.
In a way, yes. And it's a reminder that we can become so attached to our own narratives, our own sense of identity.
That we blind ourselves to reality.
Precisely. And it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind obedience, of following orders without questioning their validity.
That's a sobering thought. It makes you wonder, what outdated beliefs am I clinging to?
What narratives am I telling myself that might be keeping me stuck?
Yeah, that's a good question to ask ourselves.
And I think that's a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, from values to death to the media, we've been all over the place. So much to unpack in this book.
Right. And it all ties together in a way.
I mean, we create stories in our heads about who we are and what the world is like.
Yeah. And we get attached to those stories,
Yeah.
even when they're not serving us.
It's like we'd rather cling to what's familiar, even if it's painful.
Than face the unknown. That's the thing about uncertainty.
It can be scary.
Absolutely. But it's also where the growth happens.
That's where Manson's idea of not giving a feck comes in, right?
Exactly. It's not about being indifferent or apathetic.
It's about choosing your battles
Choosing what matters to you.
and letting go of the rest.
The things that are outside of your control.
The things that are draining your energy.
And that's not always easy.
No, it takes practice.
It's a conscious choice.
A way of life.
And it all starts with awareness.
Becoming aware of those stories we tell ourselves.
The beliefs we hold.
The values we live by.
And asking ourselves,
Are these truly my values?
or am I just living by someone else's script?
That's a powerful question.
It can be life-changing.
Because once you become aware of those limiting beliefs,
You can start to challenge them.
and create new beliefs that serve you better.
Beliefs that empower you.
Beliefs that align with your true self.
And that's what the subtle art of not giving a feck is all about.
It's about taking ownership of your life
Choosing what matters to you,
and letting go of the rest.
so you can live a life that's truly fulfilling.
A life that's worth giving a feck about.
Well said.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a wild ride.
It has.
And I hope you've learned a thing or two about the subtle art of not giving a feck.
Remember, it's not about being careless. It's about being intentional with your energy
It's about choosing your battles wisely.
and living a life that's true to yourself.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep choosing your fecks wisely.